The vote was already 3-1 when Noemi Thorne threw herself in front of the blade. She did not think. She did not calculate odds or weigh consequences, or remind herself that she was human, that she was mortal, that the council chamber beneath the Gravesend building was no place for a woman whose only weapon was knowledge. She moved because Alaric was on his knees, his white hair hanging forward like a curtain of snow, his wrists bound in silver chain that smoked faintly where it touched his pale skin, and no one else in that vast underground room was going to do a single thing to stop what was happening. The blade stopped 1 inch from her sternum. Lord Vesper, the eldest of the assembled vampires, held the ornate silver sword with a hand that did not shake. His eyes, old and colorless as river ice, studied her with the kind of contempt that only centuries of unchallenged power could produce. He was tall and skeletal, his white hair scraped back from sharp cheekbones, his suit immaculate and black, and he had not expected this. None of them had. "Step aside, Archivist," he said. His voice was the sound of old iron scraping stone. "No," Noemi said. The word was quiet. Absolute. She felt her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain every vampire in the room could hear it, and she forced herself to hold still, because she knew enough about predators to understand that movement signaled prey. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders. She was still wearing her Archivist's coat, the deep charcoal one with the worn cuffs she kept meaning to replace, and she was standing between the blade and Alaric Gravesend, Prince of the Nocturnal Court, and she was not moving. "She is human," said Lady Seraphiel from her chair at the curved council table. The contempt in her voice was almost artistic. "Remove her. She is not subject to court law. She cannot speak here." "She can stand here," Alaric said from behind Noemi, his voice low and roughened. The silver chains had worn him down. She could hear it. 3 hours they had been at this, and she had spent every one of them watching the council build their case against him with documents she herself had archived, pulled and twisted and stripped of context until they told a story that bore almost no resemblance to the truth. She had not spoken until the blade came out. She should have spoken sooner. "She is standing on sovereign ground," Noemi said, and she was gratified when her voice did not break. "This chamber is governed by the Nocturnal Accords of 1887, which I have read in full in the original Latin, and which state explicitly that any individual present during a sanctioned judgment is entitled to speak a counter-testimony before a sentence of final dissolution is carried out. Those are your own laws, Lord Vesper. I am invoking them." The silence that followed was extraordinary. Vesper lowered the blade by 1/2 inch. Not because he respected her, because she had quoted the accords correctly, and he knew it, and every vampire at that table knew it, and the laws of the Nocturnal Court were older than any of them, and they still held the weight of blood oath behind them. "You did not break a blood law for convenience. Not even Vesper." "You have," he said carefully. 5 minutes. Noemi turned around. Alaric was looking up at her, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen on him before. Not fear, not gratitude. Something older and rawer than either. His pale grey eyes, almost silver in the chamber's cold light, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the sword at her back. "Noemi," he said very quietly, "you are going to get yourself killed." "Not if I talk fast," she said. "Can you stand?" He rose. He was over 6 feet tall, and even bound and weakened, he moved with the kind of unconscious authority that centuries of command produced. The chains hung from his wrists. He was in a dark suit, his white hair disheveled, a cut along his jaw from when they had restrained him that was already beginning to close, because even silver-poisoned vampires healed faster than humans. His expression had shifted from raw to something carefully controlled, and he looked at her for one more moment before stepping to stand slightly behind and beside her, close enough that she could feel the unnatural coolness radiating off him. She turned back to face the court. She had been the Gravesend Archive's chief archivist for 6 years. She had catalogued 4 centuries of vampire court records, blood treaties, territorial agreements, and dynastic histories. She knew where every document lived, what it actually said, and crucially, what had been removed from it in the last 8 weeks. She knew this because she had noticed it. She had noticed it 3 weeks ago and told Alaric, and he had told her she was being cautious, and she had spent the next 3 weeks quietly, painstakingly, photographing everything before more of it disappeared. She had been right. She was furious about being right. She had the photographs on her phone. She pulled it out now, held it up, and began to speak. She talked for the full 5 minutes. She talked about the Treaty of Solvane, which Vesper had presented as evidence of Alaric's territorial aggression, and she explained precisely which clauses had been omitted from the version submitted to the court and what those omitted clauses actually established. She talked about the blood law regarding unsanctioned human exposure, which they had accused Alaric of breaking, and she cited the 7 exceptions to that law, 2 of which applied directly to his role as court liaison. She talked about the financial records they had used to suggest he was consolidating independent power, and she explained that those accounts were the archive's operational funds, which she could verify because she signed off on them every quarter, and her signature was on every document, and she was standing right here if anyone wanted to check. She did not raise her voice once. When she stopped, the chamber was utterly silent. Lord Vesper was staring at her. Lady Seraphiel had leaned forward in her chair. The other 2 council members, Lord Draveth and the ancient creature they called Solène, who had not spoken once during the entire proceedings, and whose age Noemi estimated at somewhere between 700 and 1,000 years, were watching her with expressions she could not quite read. The documents she references, Draveth said slowly, were verified by the court archivist. I am the court archivist, Noemi said. Another silence. The previous archivist, Draveth said. Morrow retired 8 weeks ago, Noemi said. Around the same time that documents began disappearing from the archive, I would be very interested in knowing who recommended his early retirement and whether it was financially motivated. She looked at Vesper when she said it. Vesper's eyes did not change, but something behind them shifted, and she recognized it because she had spent 6 years learning to read a species that did not telegraph emotion the way humans did. It was not guilt. Vampires did not feel guilt the way humans did. It was calculation. He was recalibrating. He was trying to determine how much she knew. She let him wonder. This court will recess, Solène said. It was the first time the ancient vampire had spoken, and the sound of the voice was something between a bell and distant thunder, quiet and absolute, and somehow filling every corner of the chamber. Everyone at the table went still, even Vesper. Recess for 48 hours, Solène continued. The evidence will be re-examined. The chains will be removed from the prince's wrists. A pause, during which Noemi held herself perfectly still. The archivist will not be interfered with. It was not a question. The council members stood, one by one. Vesper was last. He sheathed the blade with a motion so controlled it was almost elegant, straightened his jacket, and walked past Noemi without looking at her. She tracked him with her eyes until he was through the chamber door and gone. Someone removed the silver chains from Alaric's wrists. He did not make a sound while they did it, but when the last chain fell away, he exhaled slowly, and she watched him roll his shoulders once, deliberately, reasserting himself in his own skin. Then he turned to her. "Come with me," he said. She followed him out. The underground corridors beneath the Gravesend building were something between a Victorian manor and a cathedral, all dark stone and iron lanterns with electric filaments designed to look like flame. The building above was glass and steel. 40 stories of a modern investment firm that served as the primary public face of the Nocturnal Court's financial operations. Below it, beneath 3 levels of secure parking and 2 levels of mundane office space, the court existed in its true form. Stone arches, tapestries that were genuinely medieval, a library that made Noemi weak in the knees every time she entered it, and that she was technically not supposed to have accessed as extensively as she had. But Alaric had never restricted her. He walked quickly. She kept up. He took a turn she recognized, toward his private rooms, and she followed without being asked because they both understood that certain conversations required privacy. His rooms were large and minimally furnished, everything chosen for quality rather than abundance. Dark wood, high ceilings, a wall of books, a desk that was perpetually covered in correspondence he never quite finished answering. There were tall windows that looked onto an interior courtyard, and since they were below ground, the courtyard was lit with full-spectrum lights designed to simulate daylight, which she found both practical and quietly melancholy. because they were a reminder of what he could not simply walk out into. He poured 2 glasses of deep red liquid, set one in front of her. She picked it up, looked at it, and raised an eyebrow. "Wine," he said. "Burgundy, 1986. I am not offering you blood." "I know," she said, and drank. He set his own glass down without drinking and stood at the window, looking at the false sky of the courtyard. His wrists, where the silver had burned, were already smooth again, almost healed. She watched the muscle in his jaw work once. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could you," she said. "In fact, you were about to be. I am a vampire prince facing a court challenge. That is a known risk of my position." He turned from the window. "You are my archivist. That is not." "I am your archivist," she agreed, "which is precisely why I was the only person in that room who could contradict them with documented evidence. If I had stayed in my seat, you would be dead right now, and the evidence would have disappeared before morning." He looked at her for a long moment. The careful control was still on his face, but beneath it something was visible now in the set of his shoulders, in the way he was standing, that she had been quietly cataloguing for months. Something that was not simply the regard of an employer for an employee. Something older and more complicated than that. "You have been photographing documents," he said. "For 3 weeks," she said. "Since I noticed gaps. You told me there were gaps. You told me I was being cautious. I was wrong." He said it without deflection, direct and immediate. She had always respected that about him, the way he could acknowledge error without making it smaller than it was. "I underestimated Vesper's willingness to move against procedural law. He was counting on no one knowing the procedural law well enough to call him on it," Noemi said. "The archive is supposed to be a resource for the court. He forgot that it is also a resource for the people who maintain it." Alaric picked up his glass, drank, set it back down and looked at her. "Tell me everything you know about what he took," he said. She told him. She had organized it in her mind over the last 3 weeks with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, because that was how her mind worked, had always worked. Cataloging and cross-referencing and building connections between disparate pieces of information until the structure of what was hidden became visible in the shape of what was missing. Vesper had pulled 11 documents from the active archive, and she believed at least 4 from the restricted collection. The documents shared a common thread, a series of diplomatic communications between Alaric father, the late Prince Corvan Gravesend, and a faction within the Continental Court that had been negotiating a significant territorial realignment before Corvan's death 15 years ago. "Vesper was part of that negotiation," Alaric said quietly. "I think so," Noemi said. "I cannot prove it from what I have seen. But the documents he removed are the ones that would tell the story of what those negotiations concluded, or failed to conclude. And if the negotiations failed in a way that was Vesper's fault, or in a way that benefited Vesper personally, then your father would have known it. And if your father knew it and recorded it, the record would be in the archive. And if I found that record," Alaric said, "the balance of power on the council shifts." "Completely," Noemi said. "Vesper does not have the votes to remove you with a legitimate case. He never did. He has been building a fabricated one because the truth, if it is what I think it is, makes him the vulnerable one." Alaric was quiet for a moment. He set his glass down very carefully on the edge of the desk. "Noemi," he said, "what I am about to ask you, you should refuse. Tell me, anyway." The documents Vesper removed from the restricted collection would not have been taken to his personal residence. Too obvious, too legally problematic if anyone searched. He would have moved them to neutral ground, somewhere within the court's acknowledged territory, but outside the archive itself. He paused. "There is an auxiliary vault in the Gravesend satellite building, the old location, before we moved to the current address. It is technically still active court territory, but it is unmanned and largely forgotten." "You think the documents are there?" Noemi said. "I think they could be," he said. "And if they are, retrieving them before the 48-hour recess ends changes everything. But the vault requires a registered archivist's key sequence to open. A court member would trigger a record of access. A human would not." She understood immediately. "You want me to go to the vault," she said. "I want you to refuse," he said, and there was something very careful in his voice. I want you to tell me it is too dangerous and that you will instead spend the next 48 hours in a secure location while I find another solution. That is what I want. Is there another solution? A long pause? No, he admitted. Then stop telling me to refuse things, she said, and she picked up her wineglass and finished it and set it down cleanly. Give me the key sequence. Tell me the address. He held her gaze for what felt like a very long time. He looked. She thought not for the first time, like someone who had been carved out of a colder and more beautiful world than the one they currently inhabited. His features were striking in the way that things shaped by centuries rather than genes could be. All clean angles and stillness, his skin the particular pale that was not illness but something purely inherent, his silver-grey eyes the kind of color that shifted with the light. He was 34 when he had been turned, which had been in 1743, which meant that the intelligence behind his eyes had been accumulating for nearly 300 years. And sometimes, when he looked at her, she felt the weight of all of it, all that time and knowledge and careful watchfulness, directed at her specifically. She felt it now. The building will not be unguarded, he said. Vesper's meticulous. He will have placed someone there. What kind of someone? A watcher, human, likely, Court contracted. Someone whose job is to report unauthorized access, not to engage it. He thought for a moment. There is a possibility it will be Wraith. Who is Wraith? A human operative Vesp has used for approximately 20 years, extremely loyal, extremely observant, not violent by profession, but not without recourse if pushed. So I go in, move quietly, and do not push anyone, Noemi said. You make it sound simple. I make it sound manageable, she corrected. Simple would be if we had 48 hours to spare, which we do not. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was close enough that it startled her slightly, because in 6 years she had heard him be formally amused on a handful of occasions, and genuinely amused on approximately 3, and this felt like it was edging toward genuine. I am going with you, he said. You said the vault requires an archivist's key sequence, and that a court member's access would be recorded. I will not enter the vault, he said. I will be outside. Between you and anything that becomes a problem. She looked at him. She thought about arguing. She thought about pointing out that he was still silver weakened, that going anywhere near Vesper's sphere of operation while the council recess was active was exactly the kind of thing that could be used against him, that the entire point of sending her was that she could pass through unofficial court spaces without triggering the political implications he could not avoid. She thought about all of this, and she looked at his face, at the absolute implacable certainty that was sitting there under all the careful control, and she decided to spend her energy on the things she could actually change. And fine, she said. We go after dark. He nodded once. There are rooms here. Rest for a few hours. You have been in a council chamber since dawn. She had in fact been there since before dawn. She had arrived at 6 in the morning when one of Alaric's household staff, a quietly terrified young man named Thomas, who answered to Alaric and to no one else, had come to her apartment with the news that the council had convened an emergency session and that the prince had been taken into custody at midnight. She had gotten dressed in 4 minutes and been in a car in 5. She thought about the 6 years that had led to those 4 minutes. The interview she had answered on what she had thought was an eccentric posting for an experienced archivist with a specialist background in pre-20th century European documentation, which she had, because she had a doctorate in historical records management and had spent 2 years in Vienna cataloguing materials in a collection that it turned out had partial overlap with Nocturnal Court history. She had walked into the Gravesend building, expecting an unusual client, and had found Alaric Gravesend standing in the corridor outside his own office, which he had not entered, apparently because Thomas had arranged the interview papers in the wrong order, and he had been waiting for someone to fix it. She had fixed it. She had walked past him, rearranged the papers in the correct chronological sequence, and told him that his filing system was based on geographic origin, when it should have been based on documentary lineage, and that she could rebuild it in 3 months if he wanted. He had looked at her with those silver-grey eyes for a long moment and then said, "You are hired." He had told her what he was on the second day. She had taken 20 minutes alone in the archive, standing very still among the shelves. and then come back out and asked him 14 questions, all of them practical, all of them about the implications for her work, and he had answered every single one of them. He had not told her she was handling it well. He had simply answered the questions as if they were the correct questions to ask, which they were, and that had been the beginning of understanding each other. She had learned to read him over 2 years, had begun to feel something shift in the 3rd year that she had filed carefully, under professional admiration and refination and respect for an unusual mind, had spent the 4th and 5th years being quietly and rigorously honest with herself about the fact that it was not simply admiration, and had arrived at year 6 having made precisely 0 moves towards saying any of it aloud, because he was a vampire prince and she was his archivist and the political complications were genuinely substantial. She wondered sometimes if he felt it. She had no reliable data on that. He was careful and she was careful, and the carefulness made them very good colleagues and left everything else in a particular kind of suspended state that she had stopped deciding to resolve. She slept for 3 hours in one of the guest rooms off the corridor from his, and when she woke it was fully dark, and Tomas had left a tray of food outside her door and a note from Alaric that said only the address of the satellite building and the key sequence in his particular sharp handwriting, and a 3rd line that said, "Eat something." She ate something. The satellite building was in the old financial district, a part of the city that had been built in the 1890s and retained the bones of that era under a century and a half of accretion and renovation. The building was narrow and 6 stories, sandstone and dark brick, with a brass plate by the door that listed a legal consultancy that did not actually operate from the address. It was 11 at night when they arrived. Alaric drove. He drove a car that was dark and low and moved with very little sound through the night streets, and he drove the way he did most things, with precise attention and complete ease, and Noemi sat in the passenger seat and reviewed the key sequence in her mind and did not look at his hands on the wheel more than twice. They parked half a block away. He turned off the engine, and they sat for a moment in the dark. "The vault is in the basement," he said, "sub-basement. There is a staircase at the back of the ground floor, past the main reception space. The key panel is behind a section of shelving that swings out when you press the 3rd shelf from the bottom on the left side." "Practical," she said. "My father built it," he said. "He had a theatrical streak." She looked at him. It was the most personal thing he had said about his father in her presence in 6 years, and she recognized it for what it was. The particular kind of openness that emerged from people who were genuinely worried and trying not to show it. "I will be careful," she said. "Noemi." He turned in the seat to face her, and the streetlight came through the windshield at an angle that made the white of his hair almost luminescent. "If Wraith is there, or anyone Vesper has placed, you do not engage, you come back to me. And then what? We go home and tell the council we tried." "And then I go in," he said. "The record of my access will complicate things, but it will not end them. I can manage a complication. I cannot manage you being hurt." She held his gaze. There was something happening between them in the small dark space of the car that had been building for approximately 4 years, and that she was not going to do anything about right now, because they had a vault to access and 48 hours that were already 30 hours deep, but she was aware of it with a clarity that felt like the specific consequence of having nearly watched him be executed that morning. "Okay," she said. "If there is active opposition, I come back to you," he nodded. "But if it is just a locked door and a filing system," she added, "I am handling it." "I would not expect otherwise," he said. And he was looking at her with an expression she had no archive entry for, something open and particular, and not at all professionally contained, and then he looked away through the windshield at the building down the street. "Go," she went. The front door of the building was on a lock that her general archivist credentials still opened, because whoever had set this up had not thought to revoke them. She stepped inside into a reception space that smelled of old paper and undisturbed air, found the back staircase exactly where Alaric had described it, and went down. The sub-basement was cool and very quiet. She found the shelving unit, pressed the 3rd shelf from the bottom on the left side, and felt it swing out with a solidity that was extremely satisfying from a construction standpoint. The key panel was there. She entered the sequence. The vault opened. It was a small room. maybe 4 meters square, lined with flat-file drawers and fitted shelving, climate-controlled. She turned on the work light she had brought and started systematically through the drawers. She found the documents in the third drawer from the top. Not all of them. 4 of the 11 that had been removed from the active archive. But among the 4 was a bundle of correspondence that had been tied with a silk ribbon that had faded from red to rust. And when she opened it and read the first page, her breath stopped entirely. It was a letter from Alaric Gravesend, dated 1987, addressed to the Continental Council, and it detailed with specific names and dates a scheme by which a council member, named in full, had falsified the terms of a territorial agreement to channel unreported income from a network of human-facing businesses directly into personal accounts. The council member named was Vesper. There was evidence. Financial records, in Corvin's notation. Names of the human intermediaries. Dates. Amounts. Corvin had known. He had assembled this, and he had, based on the correspondence that followed, confronted Vesper privately and offered him a choice. Resign from the council voluntarily within a year or face formal accusation, and then Corvin had died. A road accident, the official record said. Unexpected, terrible, a genuine tragedy. She photographed every page. She was on the last page when she heard the footstep. It was a single step, very quiet, on the stone floor outside the vault. She would not have heard it if the vault had not been so entirely silent, or if she had not spent 6 years developing the particular attentiveness that came from working in quiet spaces, where you were often the only human being. She kept her phone absolutely still. Finished photographing the last page. Turned off the work light with one hand. In the dark she breathed once and then moved, putting the documents back in the drawer exactly as she had found them. Because if whoever was outside this vault did not already know she had been in here, they did not need to know what she had accessed. She closed the drawer, stepped to the side of the vault door, into the frame's shadow. Then she waited. Wraith, if it was Wraith, did not enter the vault. She heard him outside the door, the specific quality of stillness that meant someone listening. She matched it. She could do patient. She had been doing patient for 6 years. After approximately 3 minutes, she heard the footsteps move away. She waited another 2. Then she slipped out of the vault, pulled the shelving unit back into place, and went up the stairs and out the front door. Alaric was standing on the pavement exactly where the car had been, because he had moved the car and moved himself, and he was at the mouth of the side alley between 2 buildings across the street. She crossed to him. He stepped out and looked at her with an intensity that she recognized as the controlled version of something considerably more urgent. Someone was there, she said quietly. I think they heard me, but did not confirm I had been inside the vault. I left everything in place. Are you hurt? Not even slightly, she said. But Alaric, I found them. 4 of the documents. And among them, she held up her phone. Is a letter in your father's handwriting that will end Vesper's position on this council permanently. He went very still, not the careful stillness. Something else. Something that moved through him visibly. A wave of something she would not have characterized as grief exactly, because it was mixed with something fiercer than grief. Recognition, maybe. The confirmation of a truth he had suspected for 15 years. He knew, Alaric said. He knew, she confirmed, and he built a case, and then he died. And Vesper has been sitting on that council for 15 more years, waiting to see if anyone would find it, Alaric said, waiting for me to threaten him enough, that moving first became necessary. You became necessary when you started asking questions about the territorial agreements, Noemi said. You asked me to pull those documents 4 months ago. That was when Morrow started disappearing things. Alaric was silent for a moment. He was looking at her phone. May I, he said. She gave it to him. He looked at the photographs. She watched his face while he did, the careful absolute control of it, the way he moved through each image with the same complete attention he brought to everything. When he got to the letter, something changed in his jaw. Just that. A single muscle. He gave her phone back. We go back to the court, he said. Tonight. I am not waiting for the recess. What about Solenne's order? She asked. 48 hours. Solenne gave us 48 hours to re-examine evidence, he said. We have new evidence. Solenne will understand the distinction. He looked at the building across the street and then back at her. And Noemi. I want you to send those photographs to a secure external server before we go anywhere near the court. Somewhere Vesper cannot reach. Already done, she said. When I was in the vault, I sent them to 3. He looked at her. You sent them, he said, while you were in the vault. Silently, she said. Wi-Fi upload takes 7 seconds with a good connection. The building had a service signal. Another almost law. This time it crossed the line into actual. It was a quiet sound, private, almost surprised, and it changed his face in a way that she had never precisely seen before. Opened something in it that was usually held at a distance, and she looked at it for 1 honest second before she made herself look at the street instead. Get in the car, he said, but the warmth of the laugh was still in his voice. She got in the car. They were at the Gravesend building in 20 minutes. Alaric did not bother with the public entrance. He used a side access she had known about but never used, and they went directly down to the court level without encountering anyone. He was moving with a different quality now, the silver-weakened exhaustion of the morning, burned off by whatever was driving him forward, and when he moved like this, purposeful and absolutely sure of where he was going, and why she found herself keeping pace with a kind of alignment that she did not bother to analyze. He sent word to Solène through Thomas. He did not send word to anyone else. Solène came to a private antechamber rather than the full council chamber, which told Noemi something about the ancient vampire's understanding of discretion. Solène was smaller than she expected, always every time, because the voice and the age suggested something larger. A woman in apparent middle age, her white hair coiled at the nape of her neck, her skin like alabaster, her eyes a pale gold that was the most distinctly non-human physical characteristic Noemi had observed in any vampire she had ever met. She wore charcoal grey and she moved without sound, and she had the particular quality of absolute stillness that Noemi associated with things that had been alive long enough to stop rushing. Show me, Solène said. Noemi handed her the phone. Solène went through the photographs. Her expression did not change. Her eyes moved with precision across each image. When she reached the letter, she was quiet for so long that Noemi began to count seconds reflexively and stopped when she reached 40. Corvin gave him a choice, Solène said. Yes, Alaric said. And Corvin died. Yes. I have wondered, Solène said very quietly. For 15 years. She handed the phone back to Noemi. This is sufficient. The original documents are in the vault at the satellite building, Noemi said. We did not remove them. We can confirm their presence and authenticate them formally. They will not be in the vault by morning, Solène said. Vesper will move them tonight. The fact that someone accessed the building will reach him within the hour if it has not already. She looked at Alaric. The photographs will suffice. I know your father's handwriting as well as I know my own. What are you going to do? Alaric asked. What should have been done 15 years ago, Solène said. And what I will tell you now, Alaric, is that I am sorry it was not. I suspected. I did not have evidence, and I told myself that suspicion without evidence was insufficient to act on. A pause. Your human archivist was less patient. She is more thorough, Alaric said, and there was something in the way he said it. Solène looked at Noemi, not with contempt and not with assessment, with something that might have been, from a creature nearly 1,000 years old, the specific form of respect that is given without needing to be acknowledged. You may wait here, Solène said. Both of you. This will not take long. Solène left. The antechamber was small and had 2 chairs and a table with a carafe of water. Noemi sat in. Alaric did not sit. He stood at the far wall with his hands linked behind his back and looked at nothing in particular, and after a moment she stopped watching him and poured herself a glass of water, and drank it, and stared at the middle distance, and let herself simply feel how tired she was. She had been awake for approximately 38 hours. Noemi, he said. She looked up. He was looking at her now. He had turned from the wall while she was not watching, and he was standing 3 feet away, and looking at her with that open, uncontained expression she had seen in the car outside the satellite building, and he was not doing anything to put it away. When you stood in front of that blade this morning, he said. I know, she said. You cannot know what I know, she said again more gently. I know, Alaric. He was quiet. I have been, he said then carefully, conducting myself according to a very reasonable and defensible set of considerations for approximately 3 years. A pause. I am finding them considerably less defensible this evening. Her heart did something she was not going to catalogue right now. The considerations, she said. Do they have to do with the significant practical complications of a relationship between a human archivist and a vampire prince, among which number the obvious political exposure, the disparity in lifespan, and the argument that you have a duty of care to an employee that precludes? Yes, he said. All of those I have been conducting myself according to the same considerations, she said, for approximately 4 years. He looked at her. And this evening, she said, very carefully, I am also finding them less persuasive than usual. He crossed the remaining 3 feet between them in one step that was so quiet she registered it only as a change in proximity, and then he was there, close enough that she had to angle her chin upward to see his face. And he was looking at her with all 300 years of everything that he was, and none of the professional distance that usually accompanied it. I need to say this clearly, he said, because I will not do it ambiguously. Say it then, she said. I love you, he said. I have loved you for 3 years, with the most complete and unambiguous certainty I have experienced in 3 centuries of existence, and I have said nothing because I am your employer, and you are human, and the political structure of what I am made the saying of it, so something I could not in good conscience impose on you, and I am aware, his voice dropped slightly, that this is still true. But I am less able to remain silent about it than I was this morning, because this morning you stood in front of a blade for me, and the thought of you doing that and not knowing, Alaric, she said. Yes. I know, she said, for the 3rd time, and she reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, and he went absolutely still under her touch the way a large and carefully held thing goes still when something steady meets it. I love you too, she said. I have been inconveniently in love with you for 4 years, and I have been extremely professional about it, and I would very much like to stop being professional about it now, if that is acceptable. It is, he said, and his voice had dropped to something very quiet, the most acceptable thing anyone has said to me in 3 centuries. He kissed her then, or she kissed him, or they did it simultaneously in the way that things happen, when they have been waiting long enough that the beginning is mutual and the distinction does not matter. It was not tentative. It was not uncertain. It was the specific quality of something that had been held carefully for a very long time finally allowed to simply be, and she felt the coolness of him and the extraordinary gentleness of him and the absolute certainty of him all at once. And she thought, with the part of her mind that never fully stopped cataloguing, that this was the most accurately she had ever classified anything. Solène returned in 45 minutes. Vesper had been removed from the council. His titles were suspended pending formal review. 2 of the human intermediaries named in Corvin's letter had already been identified, and their connection to Vesper's financial network was being verified by Draveth, who it turned out had his own long-standing suspicions and was gratified to have a documented basis for them. Lord Vesper himself had been taken into formal court custody, which among vampires was an extremely serious designation involving silver jaw and stone and a level of restriction he was not going to find comfortable. Lady Seraphiel had, in the face of Vesper's removal, amended her position with extraordinary speed. She was following his lead, Solène said. She is not without self-interest, but she is also not without pragmatism. She will not be a problem. And the charge against me? Alaric asked. Formally dismissed, Solène said. The fabricated evidence is on record as fabricated. The archivist's counter-documentation is on record as accurate and will be entered into the court record under her name. Solène looked at Noemi. You have, in addition, flagged 6 procedural failures in the council's evidence, handling that the court will need to formally address. I will need your formal testimony for the record. I will prepare it, Noemi said. Good. Solène looked between them. She had the quality of someone who noticed everything and selected very deliberately what to acknowledge. You may both go. Get some sleep, Alaric, she added. The court owes you a significant apology. I will deliver it formally at the next session. It is not me the court needs to thank, Alaric said. Solène looked at Noemi one more time. No, she agreed. It is or not. They went up. Not to separate rooms, and not to the archive, and not to any of the spaces where they had been conducting themselves with professional precision for 6 years. Alaric took her to the courtyard with the full-spectrum lights, the one that simulated daylight, and they sat on the stone bench at its center, and the light was warm and golden and entirely artificial, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he rested his chin on the top of her head, and they stayed there for a long time without speaking. "Your father knew," she said eventually. "Yes," he said. He chose a private confrontation over a public accusation. "That is who he was," Alaric said. "He believed that private resolution was more stable than public destruction. He believed it would hold." A pause. "He was wrong about Vesper. He could not have known how far Vesper would go," she said. "No." A long quiet. "He could not." She felt him breathe, slowly, with the particular rhythm of someone who was not breathing because they needed to, but because the act of it was connected to being present, which it was, which was something she had understood about him quite early, and found deeply humanizing in someone who was quite specifically not human. "The lifespan problem," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are going to have to tell me what you actually think about it," she said. "Not the diplomatic version," he considered. "It is real," he said. "It cannot be made not real by wanting it to be otherwise. You will age, I will not. I am 34 in appearance, and I have been 34 in appearance for nearly 300 years, and I will be 34 in appearance in another 300 years, and eventually you will not be here, and I will still be here, and that is a fact that carries a weight I would be dishonest to minimize." "I know," she said. "I am not asking you to minimize it. I am also not," he said very carefully, "willing to use it as a reason to remove from both our lives something that is genuine and significant, and that we have both, apparently, been sitting with for years. That would be a particular kind of cowardice that I do not think either of us is capable of." "No," she agreed. "It would not be an honorable solution." "There are options," he said. "They are not simple. There are aspects of what I am that can be passed through a process that is not uncomplicated and that I would never impose and that you would need to fully understand before it could be a real choice." "Tell me about those options," she said. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight you have been awake for 40 hours and have faced down a vampire court, retrieved evidence from a guarded vault, and been kissed for the first time in what I am estimating is a significant personal development. Let some of that settle." She laughed. It surprised her, the full honesty of it, the way it came up and out without being managed. "A significant personal development," she said. "I am attempting understatement," he said. And she could hear the warmth in it, the genuine, unguarded warmth that she had been cataloguing in glimpses for years, and that now sat in his voice openly and easily, as if it had simply been waiting for permission. "I am not entirely successful." "No," she agreed. "You are not." She tilted her head back to look at him, and the light fell over his face, and he was looking down at her with something so complete and particular that she thought of all the documents in the archive, all the centuries of recorded history that he had accumulated and stewarded, all the weight of what he was, and she understood that this face, right now, looking at her like this, was not a document. It was not something to be carefully preserved and kept at archival distance. He pressed his lips to her forehead. Warm, or warm enough, because the courtyard lights raised his skin temperature slightly, a fact she had documented once in an entirely professional margin note, and thought about considerably more than was necessary for professional purposes. "Sleep," he said. "Not yet," she said. "Noemi, 5 more minutes," she said. "The light is good out here." He made a sound that was entirely fond and not at all disagreeing, and his arm settled around her shoulders with the kind of certainty that meant it was staying there. And she leaned into it and looked at the false warm sky, and felt the particular quality of tiredness that comes after something very frightening has been survived and resolved. The next weeks were not uncomplicated. They were not expected to be. The court conducted a formal review of Vesper's activities spanning not 15 but 40 years, because once the financial fraud was on record, other things began to surface, and Draveth turned out to be genuinely thorough when given the institutional authority to be. Noemi prepared 6 formal testimony documents for the court record. She also, with Alaric's full support, rebuilt the archive's access and security protocols from the ground up, because what Morrow had been able to do in 8 weeks, without anyone noticing was a systematic failure that she was not prepared to leave unremedied. She hired 2 additional archivists, humans with appropriate background clearances, neither of whom was told the full nature of what they were archiving for the first month, and both of whom handled the revelation with varying degrees of composed professionalism. Marcus, the younger one, went immediately to his phone to look things up. Priya, the senior one, asked Noemi 11 questions, all of them practical, and Noemi recognized herself in it so clearly that she had to look at the shelves for a moment to keep from smiling. Lady Seraphiel remained on the council and, true to Selene's assessment, did not create further difficulties. She was not warm toward Noemi, and she never would be, but she was not hostile, and in the ecology of the Nocturnal Court, not hostile was a sustainable arrangement. Vesper was formally tried by court standard in March. The evidence from Corvan's documents, authenticated by 3 separate procedures, formed the core of the case. The human intermediaries were handled through separate channels that Noemi had less visibility into, but Alaric briefed her fully, and the outcomes were legally sound. Vesper lost his titles, his seat, and his territorial holdings. He was bound under conditions that Alaric explained to her in terms she could follow, a form of very long-term restriction that was not death, but was the closest vampire equivalent to significant imprisonment, and that would last for something between 50 and 200 years depending on formal review. She did not feel sorry for him. 2 months after the council session, on a Thursday evening in mid-November when the city outside was wet and cold, and the archive's heating system was doing its admirable best, Alaric came to the archive and stood at the end of one of the long reading tables with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, which was his version of casual, and he set a folder on the table. She looked at it. "The options," he said. "That I mentioned in October." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He sat across from her. He explained it clearly and completely, without minimizing and without overstating. There was a process. It was not the same as simply being turned, which was not possible to consent to fully until it happened, and which he would not offer. It was something older, a thing that the very oldest vampires understood, and that Selene had helped him research. A partial integration that extended human life considerably without completing the transformation, and that required fully conscious consent at every stage. It was not permanent in a single act. It was gradual. It could be reconsidered. "It has risks," he said. "Tell me them," she said. He told her them. She asked questions. He answered them. She asked more questions. He did not tell her to stop asking. He refilled her tea from the archive's small kitchen, halfway through, and came back and answered more questions. It took 2 hours. At the end, she said, "I need to think about it." "Yes," he said. "Of course. Not because I am uncertain about what I want," she clarified, "but because this is a significant decision, and I intend to think about it properly, which is going to take more than one evening." "I know," he said. "If I say yes," she said, "I want to understand every stage before it happens. I want documentation." He looked at her, and the warmth in his eyes was so open now, so entirely unguarded, that she thought she would never get used to it, and was very glad of that. "I will personally write you documentation," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand. His hand was still. Then it closed around hers with a care that had the quality of something very old choosing to be very gentle. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "Completely and permanently and without the slightest reservation." "That is not understated at all," she noted. "No," he agreed. "I have stopped attempting understatement." She laughed and squeezed his hand, and he turned his over under hers to hold it properly, and outside the archive, the November rain came down on the old city, and inside the archive the lights were warm, and the shelves held 4 centuries of history, and everything that had been hidden was now on record, documented and verified and true. She gave him her answer 3 weeks later, on a Sunday in the courtyard with the full spectrum lights. She said yes. He held both her hands in his for a long moment, looking at her, and she looked back at him, and there was no more professional distance between them, and no more careful consideration, and no more suspended state of the last 6 years. There was only this, the specific reality of 2 people who had come to know each other with complete attention and chosen each other with complete clarity, and the future that was long and complicated and entirely theirs. "There is something I want to show you," he said. He took her that afternoon to a part of the building she had not been in, a section of the sub-basement that was not connected to the court level, but had its own access, through a door she had wondered about for 6 years. On the other side of the door was a room the size of a small concert hall, and it was full of windows, real windows, floor to ceiling, facing a direction she recalculated twice before understanding, because the building above was oriented, so that this interior space faced north, and north-facing windows in November at this latitude received no direct sunlight. They faced a preserved courtyard garden, something elaborate and Georgian, hidden within the building's interior structure, and it was full of stone paths and old trees that had been growing here for as long as the building had stood, and everything was wet from recent rain, and the grey sky above was the real sky. "It is safe," she said. "Full northern exposure only," he said. "The calculation was verified before the renovation. No direct sun reaches this space at any point in the year." She looked at the grey sky and the wet garden and the old trees. "You can come here," she said. "I can come here," he said. "And in the summer, in the evenings, when the angle is right, the light gets very beautiful." She understood why he was showing her this. It was not just a place. It was the fact of it. The specific thing he had built or preserved or claimed, a piece of the real sky that he could safely stand under. He was showing her something that mattered to him, not as a gesture, but as the genuine opening of his world to her presence in it. She stepped out of the doorway and into the garden. The stone path was wet under her shoes. The air was cold and clean and completely real, no filtered system, no full-spectrum approximation, just the grey November air of an old city settling into evening. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway. "Come out," she said. He stepped out. He stood on the wet stone path in the grey light and looked up at the sky, and his face was entirely open in a way that was different from every other openness she had seen in him. It was simple, just simple. The way looking at the real sky when you are safe is simple and enormous. She went to stand beside him. He put his arm around her. They stood in the garden under the grey November sky, and the old trees dripped quietly around them, and the court was above, and the archive was below, and the future was very long, and she was warm and he was cool, and neither of them needed to be anything other than exactly what they were. "The documentation," she said eventually. "I will begin it tonight," he said. "I want footnotes," she said. "Obviously," he said. "And a bibliography? Noemi, I am serious. If you are asking me to make a multi-century decision based on your explanation, I want a bibliography." He looked down at her. "You," he said, "are the most thorough person I have ever met in 3 centuries of existence." "Yes," she said. "That is why you hired me." "No," he said. "That is why I fell in love with you." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the wet garden and the old trees and the real grey sky. "Footnotes and a bibliography," she said. "Footnotes," he said, "and a bibliography. I give you my word." The word of Alaric Gravesend she had learned over 6 years was the most reliable document in the entire archive. She had never found a single exception, and she did not expect to find one now. She believed him completely. Standing in the garden in the November cold under the real sky, with the future stretched out ahead of them like something vast and uncharted, and entirely worth the work of mapping it properly, together, with appropriate documentation and mutual and absolute devotion, and not a single unresolved thread between them. The rain started again, light and cold, and neither of them went inside.